The bathroom mirror reflected a stranger's face. Suzanne stared at herself and didn't recognize this woman with dark circles under her eyes, with hair she hadn't washed in 3 days. Behind the door, Emily was crying. Again. Always. The baby was only 8 weeks old, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since she was born. She'd imagined everything differently. In her dreams, motherhood was filled with light, tenderness, that special bond everyone talked about. But reality was cruel. Every morning began with forcing herself out of bed. Every evening ended with tears she hid from her husband, David. The crying intensified. Suzanne flinched and slowly opened the door. Emily lay in her crib, her tiny face red from screaming. Suzanne picked up her daughter, but instead of relief, she felt only emptiness. Cold, frightening emptiness where love should have been. What's wrong with me? Why don't I feel what I'm supposed to feel? She held Emily to her chest and began rocking her, mechanically, without emotion. The baby calmed down, but Suzanne felt no joy, only exhaustion. Endless, all-consuming exhaustion that had seeped into every cell of her body. David was at work. He tried to help, but he didn't understand. How could he? He saw a happy wife who held it together, smiled when needed, said the right words. He didn't see how she stood by the window at 3 a.m, thinking about what would happen if she just disappeared. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from her friend Sarah. "How are you? How's the little one? You must be over the moon right now." Suzanne put Emily back in her crib and turned away. Over the moon. She couldn't even remember what solid ground looked like. Her fingers trembled as she started typing a response, then deleted everything and simply wrote, "Everything's fine, thanks." Lies had become her second language. That evening, when David came home, she was sitting on the living room floor. Just sitting, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at one spot. Emily slept in the stroller nearby. "Suzanne?" Her husband's voice was alarmed. He dropped to his knees beside her. What happened? She wanted to tell the truth, wanted to scream that she was drowning, that she couldn't cope, that she was afraid of her own thoughts. But instead she whispered, "I'm just tired." He hugged her, and she let herself lean into him. But even this warmth couldn't melt the ice inside. The next day she forced herself to see a doctor. Sitting in the waiting room with Emily in her arms, she rehearsed the words over and over. "I need help. Something's wrong. I don't feel anything." But when the doctor asked, "How are you feeling?" Suzanne smiled and answered, "A little tired, but everything's okay." The doctor nodded and said something about the postpartum period, about how this would pass. Suzanne left the office with the same weight on her soul that she'd arrived with. The weeks blurred into one grey fog. She fed Emily, changed diapers, rocked her, but did it all like a robot. Inside there was nothing but darkness. Sometimes she caught herself thinking that her daughter would be better off with a different mother, one who could love her. That thought scared her most of all. One evening, when Emily finally fell asleep, Suzanne opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she typed into the search bar, "Don't feel connected to my baby." Page after page told her she wasn't alone. Postpartum depression. Those 2 words changed everything. She began reading other women's stories. They described the same thing, the same emptiness, the same fear, the same sense of failure. Tears streamed down her cheeks. For the first time in 3 months, she was crying, not from despair, but from relief. She wasn't a monster. She was ill. The next morning, Suzanne made another doctor's appointment. This time, she didn't let fear silence her. When the doctor asked how she was feeling, Suzanne looked her in the eyes and told the truth. "I'm not okay. really not okay, and I need help." The doctor listened carefully, asked questions, and with each answer, the weight on Suzanne's shoulders became a little lighter. At the end of the appointment, the doctor gave her a list of organizations that could help. Among them was a brochure about the Heads Together campaign. "They hold events for mothers," the doctor said. "There you can hear other women's stories, and you'll learn you're not alone." Suzanne took the brochure with trembling hands. On the cover it said, "Let's talk about mental health." Maybe she really wasn't alone. Maybe there was a way back to the light. And for the first time in a long while, something like hope appeared in her chest. On March 24th, 2017, Suzanne stood before the mirror trying to force herself to leave the house. Today there was a Heads Together event in London, an event about maternal mental health. She'd signed up 2 weeks ago, but now that the day had arrived, fear almost paralyzed her. What if everyone thought she was a bad mother? What if they judged her? David entered the room with Emily in his arms. The baby was now 5 months old and had started smiling. Each smile was a small miracle for Suzanne, a reminder that somewhere inside her, she still had the ability to feel. "You'll be fine," David said quietly. "I'm proud of you." She nodded and kissed her daughter on the head. In recent weeks, something had started to change. The antidepressants the doctor prescribed had begun working. The fog in her head became slightly less dense. She still felt the heaviness, but now she could breathe. The hall where the event took place was filled with women. Young and older, with strollers and without. Suzanne sat in the back row, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. A woman about her age with a baby in her arms sat down beside her. "First time here?" she asked quietly. Suzanne nodded. "Me too." The woman smiled tiredly. "I'm Rachel, and this is my daughter Sophie." "Suzanne, and my daughter Emily is home with my husband." They exchanged understanding glances. No explanation was needed for why they were here. Their presence spoke for itself. The event began. Representatives from Best Beginnings, a Heads Together partner, took the stage. They showed short films about maternal mental health, about how important it is to talk about your feelings, not to be afraid to ask for help. And then they announced that the Duchess of Cambridge would be joining them. The room went still. Suzanne straightened in her chair, her heart beating faster. Kate Middleton entered the hall in a simple blue dress, with a warm smile on her face. She didn't look like a distant royal figure, but like an ordinary woman who understood. Kate began to speak, and Suzanne felt something inside her respond to every word. "For me personally, becoming a mother has been such a rewarding and wonderful experience," Kate said, and the hall was absolutely silent. "However, at times it has also been a huge challenge." Suzanne stopped breathing. The Duchess, who seemingly had everything, was admitting that she too found things difficult. Nothing can really prepare you for the sheer, overwhelming experience of what it means to become a mother. Kate continued. "It's full of complex emotions, of joy, exhaustion, love, and worry, all mixed together." Rachel beside her quietly sobbed. Suzanne felt her own eyes fill with tears. "There's no right way to be a perfect mother," Kate said, and her voice was filled with sincerity. "You just have to do your best and do what you can to take care of your family." These words were like balm on an open wound. All this time, Suzanne had blamed herself for not coping, for not meeting some ideal. But the ideal didn't exist. They were all just doing their best. For many mothers, including me, this can at times lead to lack of confidence and feelings of being overwhelmed, Kate added. She too. Even she had doubts. After the speech, there was an opportunity to talk. Suzanne gathered her courage and approached a small group of women sharing their stories. One told about how she was afraid to admit to her husband that she didn't feel connected to her son. Another talked about panic attacks that started after giving birth, and I was afraid I was a bad mother. Suzanne said quietly, and everyone turned to her. I looked at my daughter and felt nothing, just emptiness. And that was the scariest thing. "You're not a bad mother," said an older woman with kind eyes. "You're an unwell mother. And that's completely different. And you're already taking the first step. You're here." Suzanne nodded, unable to speak. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but this time they didn't bring pain. These were tears of liberation. At the end of the event, organizers offered everyone the chance to leave their contact information for a support group. Suzanne signed up without hesitation. Rachel stood nearby doing the same. "Maybe we could call each other," Rachel suggested. "Absolutely." Suzanne smiled her first real smile in many months. When she stepped outside, the spring sun seemed brighter than usual. Suzanne took out her phone and texted David, "I'm not alone, and we'll get through this." His response came instantly. "I always knew you were strong. Love you." Suzanne pressed the phone to her chest and let herself believe those words. Maybe she really was strong. Maybe admitting weakness and asking for help was the real strength. There was a long road ahead. Therapy, medication, work on herself. But now she knew she wasn't walking that path alone. There were other mothers just like her. There was help. There was hope. And most importantly, for the first time in many months when she thought about Emily, warmth appeared in her chest. Small, cautious but real. This was the beginning. The following months were like climbing a steep mountain. 2 steps forward, 1 back. There were days when Suzanne woke up and felt she could breathe. There were days when the darkness returned with doubled force. The support group became her salvation. Every week, 6 women gathered in a small cafe near central London. They drank tea, shared stories, cried and laughed, sometimes simultaneously. Rachel became her close friend. They called each other almost every day, supporting one another in moments of weakness. When Suzanne called at 3 a.m. in panic, Rachel always answered, and Suzanne did the same for her. "We're like an emergency response team," Rachel joked, except instead of fires, we put out panic attacks. Therapy helped, but it was difficult. The psychologist asked questions Suzanne didn't want to answer, about her childhood, her fears, about what kind of mother she wanted to be and what kind she'd become. Each session was emotionally draining, but afterward things felt a little lighter. The antidepressants worked, but had side effects. Suzanne constantly felt mild nausea, and the first weeks were especially hard. But she held on because she knew this was temporary, and the result was worth it. David tried to understand, but sometimes couldn't. One evening he asked, "Do you feel better yet? The medication should be helping, right?" Suzanne looked at him with tired eyes. "It's not a magic pill. I'm better, but not well yet." He hugged her, and she felt his helplessness. He wanted to fix everything, but couldn't. And that was okay. She was gradually learning to accept help, but also understood that healing was her own journey. Emily was growing. At 8 months, she started crawling, and Suzanne caught herself smiling as she watched her daughter. Not forced, genuinely. These moments were rare, but they were happening more often. One day, Emily reached out to her and said something that sounded like "Mama." Suzanne picked her up, and in that moment felt what she'd been waiting for so long. Connection. Real, deep connection between mother and daughter. She held Emily to her chest and cried, this time from happiness. but the path was uneven. In November that year, when the weather turned grey and cold, depression returned with new force. Suzanne woke up one morning and couldn't make herself get up. David took Emily and called work, saying he'd stay home. "I'm ashamed," Suzanne whispered, lying in bed. "I was getting better, and now it's worse again. I thought I'd beaten it." "It's not a linear process," David said, repeating her psychologist's words. "One bad day doesn't mean you're back at the start." She called Rachel, who came over with Sophie. They sat on the living room floor, babies crawling nearby, and the women just stayed together. Sometimes words weren't needed, just the presence of someone who understands. "You know what my therapist told me?" Rachel said. "That recovery isn't about never falling, it's about learning to get back up." Suzanne nodded. She was getting up, again and again, and each time it became a little easier. By the end of the year, she began noticing changes. Mornings were easier now. Opening her eyes took less effort. She could play with Emily not just mechanically, but with pleasure. Her daughter's laughter stopped being just noise and became music. One evening, when Emily was asleep, Suzanne stood by her crib and looked at the little face. She was 10 months old. She was so perfect, so beautiful. And Suzanne could finally see it. Not through the lens of guilt and shame, but simply see her daughter as she was. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "Sorry I couldn't love you right away. But I love you now. So much it's frightening." Emily smiled in her sleep, as if she'd heard. The next day, Suzanne received a letter from the Heads Together organizers. They were inviting support group participants to a special event in January 2018. The Duchess of Cambridge was planning to visit the mother and baby unit at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and several mothers from the program could join. Suzanne's heart beat faster. She remembered how Kate's words at that first event had changed something inside her. What if she could thank her personally? She filled out the application, not letting fear stop her. The worst that could happen was rejection. But what if she was chosen? 2 weeks later, the response came. She was invited. Suzanne pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. The circle was closing. She'd begun her healing journey the day she first heard Kate speak. Now she had the opportunity to say thank you. Not just to a duchess, but to a woman who dared to be honest about her own struggles. One final step lay ahead. The morning of January 24th, 2018, began with anxiety. Suzanne changed her clothes several times, not knowing what to wear. David waited patiently, holding 1-year-old Emily in his arms. "You look beautiful," he said for the 10th time. Suzanne looked at her reflection. A simple dark dress, minimal makeup. She looked like an ordinary woman, like a mother who'd been through hell and come out the other side. "I'm ready," she said, though her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Bethlehem Royal Hospital was in southeast London. The mother and baby unit occupied a separate building, bright and warm. When Suzanne entered, a program coordinator greeted her. "The Duchess will arrive in half an hour," the woman said. "She'll meet with staff, tour the facility, then spend time with a group of mothers. There will be 5 of you." Suzanne nodded, trying to calm her breathing. She was led to a small room where 4 women were already sitting. One of them was Rachel. "You're here too?" Suzanne exhaled with relief. Rachel hugged her, together, like always. The other women introduced themselves. Claire with a 3-month-old son, Amanda whose daughter was with her grandmother, and Nina who was still receiving treatment in the unit. Each had her own story. Each had her own path through darkness. Time dragged slowly. Suzanne looked out the window, clenching her hands to keep them from trembling. What would she say? How could she express gratitude for something so important? And then the door opened. Kate Middleton entered the room in a blue coat and floral dress. She was pregnant with her third child, and it showed. But what Suzanne remembered most was her smile. Warm, genuine, without a trace of superiority. "Hello," Kate said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She thanked them. As if it was an honor for her, not for them. Kate sat in the circle with them, not apart, not on a pedestal, simply like another mother, ready to listen. "Tell me," she said, "what helped you most?" Claire began first. She talked about therapy, about how important it was to admit she wasn't okay. Amanda spoke about the support group, about other mothers who understood her without words. Nina talked about the unit staff who saved her life. When it was Suzanne's turn, she looked Kate straight in the eyes. "You," she said simply. "Your words helped me most." Kate tilted her head, listening. "I was at the event in March last year," Suzanne continued, her voice trembling. "I thought I was alone, that I was a monster because I didn't feel connected to my daughter. And then you said that motherhood is a challenge, that there's no right way, and I realized I wasn't broken. I was just ill, and that could be treated." Kate reached out and touched her palm. "You're very brave." "No," Suzanne shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You were brave. You spoke the truth when everyone expected only perfect smiles. You showed that you can be a mother and still struggle, and that saved me." Rachel beside her was crying quietly. The other women nodded. Kate sat very quietly, and Suzanne saw that her words had touched the Duchess. "I was just saying what I felt," Kate said gently. "Motherhood is the hardest job in the world, and we need to be honest about that." They talked for another half hour. About struggles, about hope, about how important support is. Kate asked questions, listened carefully, and Suzanne felt she was truly being heard. Not just out of politeness, but sincerely. When it was time to say goodbye, Kate stood and hugged each woman. When she hugged Suzanne, Suzanne whispered, "Thank you for everything." "Thank you," Kate replied, "for sharing your story, for your courage." Suzanne left the hospital in a different state than she'd entered. She felt lighter, not because all problems had disappeared, but because she no longer carried them alone. The circle had closed. The woman who'd helped her take the first step toward healing now knew her words had mattered. On the way home, Suzanne texted David, "Heading home. Can't wait to hug Emily." The response came instantly. "We're waiting for you." She just said, "Mama," again. Suzanne smiled through tears. Her daughter was calling for her, and she wanted to be there. Not from duty, but because she loved her with all her heart. When she opened the apartment door, Emily was sitting on the floor with toys. Seeing her mother, the baby reached out her arms and smiled widely. Suzanne scooped her up and held her tight. "Mama loves you," she whispered into her daughter's soft hair. "So much. Always." Emily wrapped her tiny arms around her neck, and in that embrace was everything. Past, present, and future. Pain and healing. Darkness and light. David stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them, and Suzanne saw tears in his eyes. He'd walked this path with her, holding her when she fell, believing in her when she didn't believe in herself. "You're back," he said quietly. "Yes," Suzanne nodded. "I'm back." They spent that evening together, playing on the living room floor. Emily laughed when David built towers from blocks, and Suzanne knocked them down again and again. An ordinary evening for an ordinary family. But for Suzanne, it was a miracle. A year ago, she couldn't imagine she'd be laughing, that she'd feel joy. that she'd look at her daughter and see not a reminder of her failure, but a perfect being she loved more than life. When Emily fell asleep, Suzanne stood by her crib and thought about the journey she'd traveled, about the darkness she'd navigated through, about the people who'd helped her find light, about the words that changed everything. She remembered Kate's face, her warm eyes, her sincerity. The Duchess could have stayed in her perfect world where everything is always wonderful. But she chose honesty, chose to show that even those who have everything face struggles. And that honesty saved lives, saved Suzanne's life. She left the room and closed the door quietly. David was already asleep, and the apartment was immersed in silence. Suzanne walked to the window and looked out at nighttime London. The city glowed with lights, and somewhere out there were other mothers currently fighting the same darkness she'd been through. She wanted them to know, there's a way back to the light. There's help. There's hope. The next day, Suzanne wrote a letter to Heads Together. She told her story completely, without shame, without fear. And at the end, she wrote, "If my story can help even one mother feel she's not alone, please share it. Let them know that postpartum depression isn't a sentence. It's an illness that can be overcome." A month later, they called and asked if she'd agree to be part of a video series about support. She agreed without hesitation. The filming was difficult. Speaking on camera about the darkest period of her life was frightening. But Suzanne remembered the version of herself who'd sat on the living room floor a year ago, thinking she'd never climb out of that pit. She was speaking for her, for that Suzanne who so needed to hear that everything would be okay. When the video came out, she was flooded with messages. Dozens of women wrote, thanking her, sharing their own stories. Each message was a reminder of how important it is to speak. How important it is to break the silence. Rachel sent her a photo, both of them with their daughters, smiling, alive. "We made it," was written below. Yes, they'd made it. 2 years had passed since the day Suzanne first attended a Heads Together event. Emily was almost 3, and she was growing into a smart, cheerful girl with her father's smile and her mother's stubbornness. Suzanne still went to therapy once a month, not because she felt bad, but because she'd learned to care for her mental health the same way she did her physical health. She no longer took antidepressants, but knew if she needed to, she wouldn't be ashamed to return to them. The support group still met, though less frequently now. Once every 2 months, 6 women gathered, drank coffee, and watched their children play together. From a support group, they'd become real friends. Claire had launched her own blog about unfiltered motherhood. Amanda had returned to work and felt stronger than ever. Nina had fully recovered and now worked as a volunteer at the Mother and Baby unit, helping other mothers. Suzanne became an ambassador for Heads Together. She spoke at events, told her story, answered letters. Every woman who wrote, "Thank you, you helped me seek help," was a reward. One spring morning in 2019, Suzanne received a letter, an invitation to a charity run supporting maternal mental health. She'd never been a runner, but decided to try. David ran beside her, encouraging her. Emily stood at the finish line with her grandmother, waving a homemade sign. "Mum, you're the best." When Suzanne crossed the finish line, her daughter rushed to her and hugged her legs. Suzanne lifted her into her arms, and Emily kissed her cheek. "I'm proud of you, Mum," the girl said seriously. Suzanne laughed through tears. "I'm proud of myself too, sweetheart." She was proud, not because she'd run 5 kilometers, but because she'd survived, because she hadn't given up when it was hardest, because she'd found the strength within herself to ask for help. That summer, Suzanne and David decided they were ready for a second child. This time, she approached pregnancy consciously, with a plan. She had a support team, therapist, group, friends. She knew the signs of postpartum depression and wouldn't stay silent if they appeared again. When she told Emily she'd soon have a baby brother or sister, the girl jumped with joy. "I'll be the best big sister," she announced. Suzanne hugged her daughter and thought about how much had changed. Once she'd been afraid she couldn't love this child. Now her love for Emily was boundless, and she knew there'd be room for another. Rachel was also pregnant with her second child. They joked that their children would grow up together, just as they themselves had walked their path together. One evening, putting Emily to bed, Suzanne told her a story about a princess who got lost in a dark forest but found her way home thanks to the stars and friends who didn't abandon her. "Is this about you, Mum?" Emily asked sleepily. Suzanne smiled. "Maybe a little about me. And I'm your star. You're my brightest star." Emily hugged her favorite toy and closed her eyes. "I love you, Mum. I love you, my joy." Suzanne left the room and stopped in the hallway. She remembered that night 3 years ago when she'd stood at this same door and felt nothing but emptiness. How far she'd come since then. In the living room, David was watching the news. They were showing a story about a new initiative by Prince William and Kate supporting early childhood development. Suzanne sat beside her husband and took his hand. "You know what I'm thinking?" she said quietly. "That one conversation can change a life." "Your conversation has changed many lives," David replied. But hers was first. Suzanne nodded at the screen where Kate was talking with a group of young mothers. She dared to be honest, and that created a wave. David kissed her temple. "And now you're part of that wave." Yes, she was part of something bigger. A movement changing how society talks about motherhood, about mental health, about how you can struggle and still not be weak. A few months later, their son Oliver was born. This time, everything was different. Suzanne carefully monitored her condition, and when at the 3rd week she felt familiar heaviness, she immediately reached out to a therapist. They adjusted the support plan, and she coped. Not because it was easy this time, but because she knew what to do. Emily was an incredible big sister. She brought Oliver toys, sang him songs, and Suzanne watched with an overflowing heart. 2 more years passed. In spring 2021, Suzanne received an invitation to speak at a conference on maternal mental health. She stood on stage before hundreds of people and told her story. "6 years ago, I didn't know what to call what was happening to me," she said. "I thought I was a bad mother, that I didn't deserve my child. I was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help." The hall was silent, and then I heard words that changed everything. "There's no right way to be a perfect mother." Those simple words gave me permission to be imperfect, permission to ask for help, and they saved my life. She saw a woman in the hall crying, another nodding. They recognized themselves in her story. If you're now where I was, know this: you're not alone. This isn't your fault. It's an illness, and it can be treated. Ask for help. That's not weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. After the speech, a young woman with a baby in her arms approached her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought it was only me. Tomorrow I'm seeing a doctor." Suzanne hugged her. "You're already on the path to healing." That evening at home, she played with Emily and Oliver on the floor. Emily was almost 6, Oliver 2 years old. They built a tower from blocks, laughed when it collapsed, and built again. David took a photo. "For the family album," he said. Suzanne looked at her children and felt what she'd felt every day for the past few years. Gratitude. Deep, sincere gratitude for a second chance, for the opportunity to be the mother she wanted to be. Somewhere in Britain, another woman sat in darkness thinking she couldn't cope. Somewhere another mother looked at her newborn and felt nothing but emptiness. But thanks to stories like Suzanne's, thanks to the honesty of people like Kate Middleton, more and more women knew there's a way back to the light. There's help. There's hope. And that hope continued to grow, spread, change lives. The circle had closed. The one who'd once been helped now helped others. The light passed to her. She passed forward, and that light grew brighter with each story told, with each life saved. Suzanne put the children to bed, kissed them goodnight, and stood in their doorway, listening to their steady breathing. She thought about the journey she'd traveled, about the darkness she'd overcome, about the people who'd reached out when she was drowning, and she knew she'd do the same for others, again and again, because no one should drown alone, because a conversation can save a life, because hope is contagious, and there's enough for everyone. This story is based on real events from the Heads Together campaign and events involving the Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton, in 2017 and 2018. The protagonist's name has been changed to protect confidentiality. Descriptions of emotions, internal experiences, and certain details represent creative interpretation based on typical experiences of women suffering from postpartum depression. All key events of the Heads Together campaign, Kate Middleton's speeches and visits, are documented facts.